Welcome to today's Explainer, everyone. I'm your host, and today we're going to structure our time together a lot like a college history seminar. We are going to look at the world through a very specific, highly focused lens. We're going to unpack the historical record of a single calendar date, June 27th. By tracing just this one day through the centuries, we're going to see how it acts as kind of a core sample of human history. It literally reveals the escalating complexity of our world, going all the way from ancient empires to the modern digital age. So grab a seat, get your notebooks ready, and let's explore how a single day can change the world over and over again. All right, let's take a really quick look at the syllabus for today. We'll start with Era 1, Early Empires, then move into Era 2, Expansion and Conflict, followed by Era 3, the Modern Age. After that, we'll cover some notable figures and transitions, and wrap the whole thing up with a seminar review and a few questions. So, diving right into Part 1, Era 1, Early Empires, focusing on the pre-1600 world. Now, in this early era, a world totally dominated by massive religious shifts, early global exploration, and the building of giant land empires, just notice the incredible leaps in human civilization captured on this one date. Back in 363 AD, Jovian is hastily proclaimed Roman emperor, right after the sudden death of Julian the night before. Fast forward a bit to 1678 AD, and we see the consecration of Pope Agatho, which was absolutely pivotal in consolidating religious power. By 1499, the focus starts shifting outward to physical borders, right? Amerigo Vespucci cites what we now know as Brazil, completely changing global maps forever. But, this expansion came at a horrific cost to human liberty. Just look at 1556, when the 13 Stratford martyrs were burned at the stake near London just for their Protestant beliefs. So already, we can see how this one date holds both the triumph of human exploration and the terrible tragedy of religious persecution. Moving right along to Part 2, Era 2, Expansion and Conflict, covering the years 1601 to 1900. Let's see how all of this builds into an age really defined by intense colonial expansion and massive industrialized warfare. Those early empires we just talked about are now clashing aggressively over global territory. In 1760, during the Anglo-Cherokee War, indigenous Cherokee warriors decisively defeated British forces. But just decades later, in 1806, those same British forces are back on the offensive, seizing Buenos Aires in South America. It's fascinating to think about how differently nations remember this exact same day. I mean, in Cherokee historical memory, June 27th is a proud day of successful resistance. But for the British in 1806, it was a day of aggressive imperial expansion. Later on, we see this date marking the bloody Battle of Kennesaw Mountain in 1864 during the American Civil War. But hey, this era isn't purely about warfare. It actually culminates in the late 19th century with human achievement pushing physical boundaries to the absolute limit. In 1898, Joshua Slocum became the first person to sail the entire globe completely alone. Pretty incredible, right? Actually, let's pause for a second on the year 1743, specifically the Battle of Dennington. Why is this particular data point so crucial for us as history students? Well, it marks the absolute last time a reigning British monarch, King George II in this case, personally participated in a battlefield clash. It represents a massive paradigm shift. Kings were no longer expected to go die in the mud alongside their soldiers. Warfare was becoming heavily bureaucratic, managed by generals from far away. The very nature of state power was evolving before our eyes. All right, on to Part 3, Era 3, the Modern Age, stretching from 1901 all the way up to the present. Brace yourselves, because the modern world moves incredibly fast. As a class, we really need to focus in on this densely packed era where huge technological leaps are matched only by profound global tragedies and incredibly rapid geopolitical shifts. We're going to start our modern analysis with a concept that feels, honestly, incredibly relevant to us today. The crucial point here is how information, and specifically disinformation, began shaping modern geopolitics. The Tanaka Memorial of 1927 was this widely circulated document that supposedly laid out a Japanese master plan for world domination. Now, the historical consensus today is that it was a total forgery. Yet, it heavily influenced international policy and stoked massive geopolitical paranoia right before World War II. It goes to show that a document absolutely doesn't have to be real to have very real, very dangerous historical consequences. As historians, we also need to take a sobering look at this next number. 13,266. This is the horrifying minimum death toll of the 1941 Yash pogrom, which was launched by Romanian authorities against the local Jewish population during the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. It is a stark, grim reminder of the kind of mechanized, state-sponsored violence that tragically came to define so much of the mid-20th century. But, contrast that devastating loss of life and human rights in Romania with what happened exactly 5 years later, in 1946, on the other side of the globe. This perfectly illustrates the post-war era's intense focus on national identity. The Canadian Parliament passed the Canadian Citizenship Act. Before this moment, Canadians were legally just considered British subjects. This act effectively codified what it meant to actually be a citizen in a rapidly shifting global landscape. So here we see June 27th acting as a day of foundational, peaceful state building in Canada, which sits directly in contrast to the utter destruction seen elsewhere just a few years prior. Of course, geopolitics isn't the only force that shapes human events. Nature left its own tragic mark on this date in 1957, when Hurricane Audrey slammed right into the Texas-Louisiana border. It claimed over 400 lives and remains one of the deadliest hurricanes in U.S. history. It's a humbling reminder that despite all our modern technological advancements, human societies are still incredibly vulnerable to the sheer force of the natural world. Okay, let's trace some rapid-fire changes in the late 20th century, comparing major regime shifts directly alongside escalating conflicts and mass casualty events. Pay close attention how wildly different nations observe this one date. For example, in 1973, Uruguay fell to a dictatorship under Juan Maria Bordaberry, obviously a very dark day for democracy in South America. Yet just 4 years later, in 1977, Djibouti gained its independence from France. So on June 27th, while Uruguayans might reflect on a painful loss of freedom, the people of Djibouti are out celebrating a national holiday of liberation. And alongside these political shifts, we see a chilling rise in modern tragedies. We had the devastating Gare de Lyon rail accident in France in 1988, the sudden outbreak of the 10-day war in Slovenia in 1991, and the absolutely shocking Aum Shinrikyo sarin gas attack in Japan in 1994. The sheer complexity of the modern state clearly brings with it some very complex, multifaceted vulnerabilities. Among those tragedies was the sudden loss of 81 lives on this day in 1980 when Itavia Flight 870 crashed into the Tyrrhenian Sea near Italy. Often called the Ustica Massacre, the exact cause of this crash, whether it was a terrorist bomb or an accidental missile strike during a military dogfight, remains intensely scrutinized and deeply controversial in Italian historical memory to this very day. Shifting back to politics for a moment, 2007 brought the end of a massive political era in the United Kingdom. After a decade in power that completely reshaped British society and foreign policy, Prime Minister Tony Blair stepped down. Unlike the violent overthrows or the sudden deaths of kings we studied back in Era 1, this was a seamless, bureaucratic transfer of power to Gordon Brown. It's a perfect example of how the actual mechanisms of state leadership have stabilized in certain parts of the world over the centuries. Which brings us to Part 4, Notable Figures and Transitions, looking at births and deaths. Because history isn't just treaties and storms, is it? It's driven by individual people. Contrasting these two monumental figures perfectly shows the vast spectrum of the human experience on June 27th. We have an incredible beginning, the birth in 1880 of Helen Keller, a woman who would overcome immense personal challenges to become a total pioneer for disability rights and a world-renowned author. And then we have a violent end. The death in 1844 of Joseph Smith, the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement, assassinated by a mob in Illinois. One represents the dawn of a lifetime of advocacy, and the other, a violent martyrdom that deeply scarred American religious history. Both profoundly shaped the cultural fabric of the United States, and both are permanently anchored to this single date on the calendar. All right, that leads us to our final section, Part 5, Seminar Review and Questions. Think of this as prep for your final exam. As we wrap up today's explainer, I really want to test your understanding of how these fragmented events weave into a much larger historical narrative. I'm going to leave you with 3 critical thinking questions to chew on. First, consider how the shift from early religious persecutions, like the Stratford Martyrs, to 20th century geopolitical wars reflects the evolving nature of state power. Second, what role do documents play in defining our national futures? Compare the stabilizing force of the Canadian Citizenship Act with the destructive paranoia caused by the forged Tanaka Memorial. And third, based on the political transitions of June 27th, going from the sudden rise of Emperor Jovian to the quiet resignation of Tony Blair, how do sudden leadership changes impact global stability? Take some time to analyze the data we cover today, challenge your baseline assumptions, and ask yourself, if one single day can hold this much triumph, tragedy, and transformation, what history is being written on this very day, right now? I'll see you at our next seminar.